This is a really long and very true story. That is the essence of Let's Not Meet, in my opinion. There's a lot of build-up, but if you're here to read about some serious insanity, this'll do ya, and then some. I'll post the first part, and if there's any interest, I'll keep going. I'll start at the beginning of this particular chapter of my life, at the most convenient break. I was in my early 20s, and had been kicked out of rehab. I hitchhiked almost across the whole country, putting all of Canada between my home city, which contained my family, but also my dealer and all the people I used to junk with, to a city I lived in a bit as a teen, before I hit rock bottom and became a full-fledged junkie, gutter punk, streetwalker. I had nearly been killed by a maniac with a claw hammer. I had seen evidence of true evil in the world, or insanity at the very least. I believed demons existed, as sure as my own hallucinations did, but those are other stories. I don't want to specify the actual cities involved here, because some of these Canadian subculture circles are sometimes small to the point of resembling incest. Many people may know about this shit, and frankly, I'm paranoid, which may be why I'm still alive several times over. Suffice to say, this all happened in a relatively large Canadian city, in a neighborhood known to be the shittiest, most druggy and hooker-infested, violent crap hole of a place in all of Great North White. And if you're Canadian, you probably know exactly where I'm talking about. I did get kicked out of rehab, but I did almost manage to stay clean. I was eager to start fresh, and with help from friends and family, I managed to enroll myself into school so I could fast-track through the prerequisites I need to be a vet tech, because animals have always been one of my big loves. I acquired a young dog in my travels, the most epic dog I've ever met, and maybe ever will meet. He was ridiculously intelligent, massive, English Mastiff Shepherd Cross, with a silver brindle coat and a head like a direwolf. He never needed a leash and just groped at me at every juncture. Our bond was telepathic. His middle name was Dolph. We had a lot of adventures together. He was every bit the Mad Max dog, but much, much larger than mine. I missed him terribly, always will, and I'm getting teary-eyed looking at his urn as I speak. Moving on. We, Dolph and I, moved from a place we shared for a couple months that was entirely inhabited, all 3 floors, by a very angry, morbidly obese, alcoholic, sex-addicted woman who hated my guts and wished me dead, and into another shitty low-rent building. I couldn't afford much, but I was looking really forward to not having to deal with aforementioned psycho ham beast any longer, because I'm tough, but no one can take on 1,200 pounds of angry, horny, drunk, and irrational. I'll surmise I'll write about this house too. I have such fat, angry sights to show ya. The new building was conveniently close to school, but odd. The complex was too squat. Rotting brick buildings, both 3 floors high, with big, rickety, old-fashioned windows. There is a depressing, damp little concrete courtyard, clogged with used syringes, crack pipes, used condoms, and the occasional mysterious single shoe. An unfinished, dilapidated, DIY fence made of rotting scrap wood, signs, nails sticking out every which way, and surrounded most of the complex like something right out of a post-apocalyptic movie. The place really had a Silent Hill vibe to it, especially when it was misty outside, which was often during that time of the year in that particular place. The acoustics were weird there and just didn't feel right most of the time for whatever reason. Dolph used to press his body to mine when we walked the halls, his hackles up, body stiff with something I couldn't sense, but trusted him to detect on my behalf. I found out later that these buildings were owned by a total slumlord who was so infamous that later there was actually an expose on him in the local paper for the buildings being so terrible, but that's yet another story. The tenants, of course, were mostly drug addicts, punks, hookers, some starving artists, students, old alcoholics, reclusive weirdos, and such. All pretty standard for this type of building. It wasn't a full-on crack building, but borderline, you know? I lived in a low-rent place before, and they were all weird in their own way, but this place was a special kind of weird. My apartment was on the main floor, and the largest apartment in the whole complex, according to Larry. Larry was the building manager, and he lived right next door to me. I couldn't guess how old he actually was, but he looked like a miniature Canadian hoser version of William S. Burroughs, or an elderly version of Dale Gribble, with his grimy baseball cap and thin, edgy old man voice that wobbled sometimes. He was a lifer alcoholic, and usually reached of stale beer and liquor. If he didn't drink, he said he got the DTs. It was summer, so he kept his door open frequently. His place was usually tidy. He was a simple and harmless guy who liked to pass the time by listening to the radio and chatting with whoever would drink with him. Youths passing through the city often stayed with him mostly because he was lonely. There was a sadness about him, which he pacified by drinking. Preferably with street kids, always male from what I saw, just keeping their company. Now that being said, he never made advances on them, and was pretty clear about being asexual. Whilst he likes hanging around with the boys, he didn't seem to be interested or comfortable around females as a rule, and I'd seen him get snippy with other female tenants. He seemed to tolerate me, no idea why. As summer progressed, a lot of weird punks and weirdos would hang out at his place and drink. A few of them were people I actually knew from other cities, so I fell in fast. As a result, Larry and I became friendly over time, and in my opinion, he was just a harmless, lonely old man. It got to the point where we were friendly enough that I gave him the keys to my place, so he could give Dolph a little walk or go out for a pee when I was at school or couldn't take him to work, and even though I was extremely poor, I gave Larry a little beer money for his trouble, which worked out okay for everyone involved. The apartment was total shit with squishy, saggy floors, peeling walls, grimy kitchen, windows painted shut, and pretty well nothing redeemable. I painstakingly chipped open those windows, put in some elbow grease, spruced up the plates with some arts, salvaged furniture, a little jar of fucking flowers, and made the joint livable, damn it. Hear me roar. As I have mentioned before, Larry's skills as a building manager were very questionable. I'm a pretty self-sufficient gal. I usually take care of minor repairs myself, but a sizable crevice opening up by the base of the bathtub, caused by the silicone curling up and flaking away, was something I call Larry about. His fix was to hammer a big square piece of soft, splintery wood into the blistery floor, so the water still dribbled down and the floor was still practically caving in, but now I had a big piece of squishy wood there, so I could get splinters, which is about as awesome as it sounds. This was basically his fix for everything, to hammer a piece of scrap wood on it. This was what accounted for the interesting fence that surrounded the buildings. But at that moment, it was still better than the house of the horny ham beast, or so I thought. Shitty repairs were something I was willing to deal with. Things continued like this for several months. Despite having to eat at soup kitchens, go all day on a 7-Eleven Jamaican patty, or go hungry frequently, I stayed clean, kept my nose down, completed my prerequisites, and got my student loan to go to college to become a vet tech. I also ran into the hot punk guy I had a huge crush on way back then, when I was only 14 years old, and still playing at being a street kid, experimenting with sex and drugs, but not really in the thick of it yet. Back then I hit him a lot, but he rejected me because A, I was jailbait, and B, I was into hard drugs and he was not. He was living in the building and dealing weed at the time. Long story short, we got together very quickly and naturally, and he kinda just ended up moving in with me. As I tell you, we've been together for about 10 years now. His nickname was Stoic because he's big, 6'4" or so, quiet, and most people, except good friends who know better, would describe him as a big, scary, standoffish, antisocial kind of guy. I was clean, in love, excelling in school, successfully picking up the pieces and enjoying every minute of it. I was interning in a clinic, as well as a dog shelter on alternating days, and also working with livestock at a popular zoo, more like a farm in the city. At the dog shelter I interned at, I fell in love with a female mastiff called Babe. Babe was severely abused by her previous owners and needed months of physical and behavioral rehab. Again, long story short, I got clearance to work with her, worked her through, and was allowed to adopt her, and now we have all the little players in our little story. I suppose I should at least try to lay out the place for you before we continue. The front door opened up to bang. The bathroom, which was a major contender if there was a crappiest, tiniest bathroom on Earth award. Probably too much information, but to this day, I don't understand how Stoic took a poo in there without having his knees up to his chin. There was always a hallway to the left, which went to the fabulous kitchen, featuring peeling 1970s linoleum flooring, leaky fixtures, dirt that couldn't be washed away, and the occasional honking big rat. The walls were thin enough that, if one of us were cooking in the kitchen, and a guest had to use the bathroom, we could hear everything crystal clear. Nothing stirs up the appetite like listening to someone pee and poo, right? Keep it classy. The kitchen had a back door that looked over a garage alley below, and a small barred window that looked right into the bathroom, so if you didn't put something over the window, anyone on the patio could watch you wee if they wanted to for an audio and visual experience. The patio looked as if It was slapped together with plywood and painted chalky toothpaste blue, janky, alarmingly creaky, and more brittle with each rainfall. It buckled alarmingly when one stepped on it, usually to smoke, and watch the hookers that congregated across the streets. Next part of the house, through a door in the hall as well as the kitchen, was the main area. It was a pretty big room, large enough to be the bedroom and living room office on opposite ends, with fairly big windows that didn't open till I took a butter knife to them. You think that living in a smallish, incredibly crappy 2-room apartment with 2 gigantic dogs and a rather large human would suck, but winter was upon us and Slumlord didn't really bother to turn on the heat too high or even on sometimes, so the dogs and the big guy were a blessing, if only in terms of the body heat they generated. It was a dreary gray piece of shit winter, but a mild one, and it passed more or less without incident. Schoolwork, and then it was spring. This is when things start to go terribly wrong. I called my old social worker at the outreach place I used to go to in my home city sporadically to catch up, and through him learned that a good friend of mine, albeit one I used to use with, had been in jail for a few months for something minor. I was overjoyed, because I thought that it was awesome that by fate we had both gone clean, even if he had no choice in the matter. I found him and started religiously sending letters and books every weekend. RL was an old friend and, like myself, trustworthy even when he was strung out. He was one of the few people I've ever met that I could really have a quick back and forth with, because our brains were both really fast, buggy, and filled with pulp culture references and general snarkiness. He was smart as fuck, funny as hell, a kick-ass writer, and always pretty chipper despite having a horrible, abusive upbringing that involved moving from foster home to foster home, being sexually abused, burned with cigarettes, hooked on junk, and turned out as a gay prostitute at 15. RL was even more awesome for living through that hell and still being a person who had some love in him. RL's release date came on fast, and when he told me, I was ecstatic. We were both clean and I'd helped him finally get his shit together. He had nowhere to go, and despite the fact that I didn't have the room by any stretch of the imagination, I told him he was welcome to stay with us, and I meant it. I excitedly mentioned my friend coming to Larry in passing for no ulterior motive, and Larry said, "He can stay with me if he wants. Sweet. Lonely old guy, charismatic young punk looking to start fresh like I did, and avoidance of the whole guy on the couch and I want to get laid fuck scenario. Everybody's happy, great, but not great." We had some wonderful time catching up, walking in the park, talking about our newfound dreams, but after about 2 weeks passed, I was starting to get a niggling feeling that he was using again. One early Saturday morning, I was on my way to the clinic internship and decided to say good morning to RL before I left. The door was ajar and I got goosebumps. The moment I saw RL from the back, I knew something was wrong. Larry was nowhere to be seen, and RL was reclined on the couch. I approached him and saw he had half of a Mike's Hard Lemonade perfectly balanced on his chest. As you maybe already guessed, he was dead. Judging by the foam around his mouth and nose, it was obvious to me it was a heroin overdose, because I'd seen them before and apparently it's a standard symptom of a opiate overdose. I think it must have been a suicide, because RL was a seasoned user, and any junkie knows never to mix junk and booze, or if you do, be careful. Or maybe he thought his tolerance was higher than it was, after being clean for a while, and which is a common reason for ODs. Regardless, his skin was light gray, his eyes the palest china blue. I sat next to his body and took a long look at him, asked him why, expressed my anger and my sadness, told him that he was free now. Eventually I called the cops, and a coroner came within an hour, zipped him into a crinkly maroon body bag. Before they left, one of them took RL's cuffed off his wrist and gave it to me like we give a dog's collar to the owner after euthanasia. Both touching and fucking heartbreaking. If I hadn't been there to tell them his full name, he would have been John Doe. His birth certificate arrived in the mail the next day. I still carry it in my wallet to this day. Understandably upset. I called the clinic and told them I wasn't going to make it. I sat in that apartment a long time, waiting for Stoic to return from work. Larry came back to the apartment hours later, visibly shaken. I didn't have any words, so I faced the wall, struggling to find something to say. He spoke first. "I can't stay in this place anymore," he said urgently in a strained voice. "Ghosts. There's going to be ghosts. He died right there, and now it's wide open, and it's all your fault, and now it's wide open, wide open." Open? He shrank and brought his arms up to his head, like the sky was falling. "Shut up, shut up, shut up! Fuck, fuck, fuck!" he shouted. His eyes widened with fear. "They'll hear you." "Who'll hear me, Larry?" He leaned in and whispered. "Them. They know now." "Wait, who knows? What are you talking about?" His eyes were wide and mad, rolling around in his head, his mouth agape and twisted in a grimace of horror that contorted his face into one of pure horror. He looked at me straight in the eyes and let out a long, ragged groan that sent chills to think about. Then before I could say anything further, as if answering a calling I could not hear, he abruptly got up and walked away, muttering to himself with his hands on his ears, swatting at things that weren't there. This was the first indication that he was a little wonky. I figured he was just dealing with the death in his own way, and respected his space. Not without expressing some bitterness over me having the big apartment that was supposed to be his, Larry moved to the basement, though it wasn't an apartment per se. It was the entire space underneath the apartments. The basement, or Larry's lair as it was named to be called, was in essence a huge black yawning space, with dank concrete walls and floors with exposed wires, drippy leaks everywhere and drains on the floor. I took one look at it, saw that it looked like something out of a horror movie, and thought that someone who was afraid of ghosts would not want to live in this basement, because it was incredibly creepy down there, but apparently he did. He moved his possessions down and life went on. The weather got warmer, and not long after Larry had moved into the basement, while sitting on that balcony of mine, I noticed there was a bunch of junk piling up outside. I'm not sure how to explain this, so you understand, but I'll try. He had the entire basement of the one building, no idea what was in the other building, and the basement had two entrances and exits. One was a normal door that went into the hallway we all used, the other a small, low window that he, with a small frame, could pull himself up and outside on his belly for an awkward but effective way in and out. There was a lane outside that window that went under two patios, mine, and what was formerly his apartment. So underneath my balcony was a large space that Larry originally had started using as an outdoor area of sorts, despite the trash cans with a couple of folding chairs and an old charcoal hibachi. Before the trash really piled up, a few little punk weirdo parties happened out there in the nice weather, and there was even some pretty good times barbecuing back there. But now, there was a bunch of trash which consisted of assorted bicycle parts, various pieces of metal, wood, junk, clutter, and garbage, and it seemed to be getting a little larger every day. Larry had become suddenly rather hostile to me in general and avoided me. I tried to be nice to him and our respective space, but he usually snapped at me every chance he got and scurried away muttering to himself. I felt terrible. He was obviously really affected by RL's death, or he had started using meth like everyone else in the goddamn building. I'll never know. I started getting really strange, nasty, often nonsensical notes left for me, unsigned but obviously from him. "You're to blame, I'm on the lam." "Go home, evil, evil, she done this." "On the lam, lax out, out, out." And the cherry on the shit sundae, freaky scribbles, often of nude women, dripping from their orifices, or strange occulty symbols, and nude women being stabbed by cruelly drawn daggers. Their faces were either smiling and ecstatic or crying and looking anguished in an exaggerated sort of way, or a mix of the two. Well, isn't that just fucking precious? At this point, I was working a bit less, and Stoic was working more at his new web development job. I came home, and before I grabbed the door to put my key in, I noticed there was something weird and gross on the doorknob, which I quickly identified to be probably shit. And when something is probably shit, it may as well be, right? I figured it was some random asshole tweaker grabbed some junk mail from the hall, cleaned it up, went in and grabbed some bleach and a rag, washed hands several times, problem solved. This happened a few more times with what I still think was probably poo, and a few times with some sort of sickly sweet-smelling chemical. I took a sample of it to school, and my prof said she thought it was antifreeze. Dolph had a quirk of rushing up the stairs and grabbing the doorknob with his mouth, and this immediately makes me think that someone was trying to poison my dogs, and that's the first time I went on the offensive, because I take a lot, but you do not fuck with my dogs. I bashed on his door and nobody answered, but I could hear things down there, so I kicked it a bunch of times, made some noise, and yelled down the stairs something to the effect of, Just a friendly reminder, if anyone fucking looks at my dogs the wrong way, I'm gonna tear out your spine and anally rape you with it. No answer. I tightened up security, and then the fucking horror escalated, unfolding like some vile blossom containing hundreds of bees that want to slap you in the face with their bee dicks, take photos, and try to blackmail you with them, but I digress. More smells. A very foul odor was emanating from a junk pile, accumulating from Larry's lair, and became unbearable as the weather got warmer. Flies were starting to collect en masse. What the heaps and smell was decidedly a rotting meat, shit, urine, barf, everything in existence. That smells terrible kind of combo, lovely. I still took all the abuse, and as things moved forward, they became more and more crazy. But that could be another story for another post. Until then, I guess I'll see you guys later, and thank you guys so much for reading this crazy story. There's a lot more where this came from, so if you guys are interested, I will post more updates in the future.